Paul, thanks very much. So what we do at the very start of this is we get people to tell us a bit about their family, where they came from, and just because, in 100 years' time this will be interesting.
Of course. Well, my parents, Anne Brophy, that was her maiden name, and she married my father, Michael Barry. And as a child, I was probably reared on Barrack Street, because my grandmother lived in number 11, the Terrace. And so my father was on shift work in the paper mills at the time and various other jobs down through the years. So we would have spent a lot of time up with my grandparents, with my mother. So I remember playing out on Barrack Street when you'd actually look up if you heard a car coming. It was unusual. Great days, and it's a vastly different place to what it is today. So my uncle Jim Brophy and my uncle Tom Brophy, my mother's brothers, they were cutters in the glass. They would have went in definitely in the 60s, but I would say early in the 50s actually. And eventually my father ended up working there in the security. He probably would have went in there in the very early 70s. And it's like everybody, I don't think there was anybody in the glass that didn't have a relative in there. It would have been very unusual not to have even a distant relative. And really, your relatives got you in there. Like my father would have gotten me in there, I suppose through persistence in the end, because coming up to the end of the 70s, the apprenticeships were beginning to stop, and a lot of the permanent jobs, were beginning to stop. In actual fact, I think we were the last tranche of apprentices to be taken on. That was in 1980. And certainly I don't remember any being taken on after that ever again. So I was pretty lucky in that sense. And but I mean, I would have had other cousins. My cousin Jim Brophy, Jim left us there a couple of years ago. He died of motor neuron. He was my best friend and my cousin, and he had gone in a year before me. He would have been Jim Senior, as I mentioned there, his son. So you had cousins, and as I said, my sister went in there as well for about a year. I think it was her first job ever, and she done a full summer of courier work. And so as I said, lots of relatives in there, some that I probably don't even know about.
And where did you go to school?
Well, I went to school in Scullercone, and then I ended up in Mount Sion, and funnily enough, my last 2 years were in Waterpark. Now, there's a story behind all that. Suffice to say, they weren't great experiences. They were not. Bullying was a huge part of it all, and in my estimation, it almost mapped out my life for me. And as I said, I didn't enjoy school. It was very, very tumultuous, strenuous time, and probably changed me for, changed what I was and what I am today.
And did you get as far as your leaving cert?
There's the funny thing, you see, it wouldn't happen today. I tell this story with great pride. I failed my intercert miserably. But there's a funny story there. I loved technical drawing and woodwork. And I'm probably the only guy in the world to fail 6 or 7 subjects. And I'm talking about E's and all the way down. And got a B+ in mechanical drawing. And I often think back and say, did somebody not look at this and say, there's something here, like this is very strange, the one subject being mechanical drawing that he excels at. Anyway, those were the days. I failed it. Again, as I said, because of the circumstances. I was never going to be at ease in school. And then, strangely enough again, my mother decided to put me into Water Park. And I got into Water Park, having failed the Inter. So go figure. But then, another 2 years of anxiety was, my God, this leaving cert facing me. And I have to say it was, it was eating away at me with worry, because nothing had changed. And my name was down in the glass, and my mother had my father badgered about any news on, and he would keep saying no. And then one day, to my relief, he arrived in, and I was upstairs, and I heard him saying to my mother, "Paul has a medical Monday morning." And my mother said, all excitement, "What does a medical mean?" "He has the job." If you recall, for a medical, that was it. So I never done the leaving, thank God, and don't care a jot that I didn't.
And do you remember your first day in the class?
Oh, quite clearly, yeah. Now, I started work when I was 14 in what's now gone, a very famous, a lot of people, you probably know it yourself. Do you remember Leo Hart's garage, petrol station, which was at the cross section there, the intersection for Tramore and Cork Road? I went in there when I was 14, and I was there about a year and a half in the gorgeous, warm, stifling summers of the 70s, and also the icy cold winters. And believe you me, they were eye-openers. I was 14, I didn't know any different. I loved it. I loved coming home with my hands numb and paining me after holding the cold pumps all day long. But to me, I was a millionaire. I had loads of money, and it was great. Then I went into the Granville, and I probably spent 2 years there. And coinciding with all of this, I was still in school when I was in the Granville. So then on the 1st of December 1980, I walked through the hallowed gates of Waterford Crystal. And I remember that morning, I was probably shell-shocked, because it was an 8 o'clock start. And no doubt I'd say my mother probably had me up at 6:30. And the sandwiches were made. And my father, he started at 8 as well, so it was handy. He brought me down. And literally what I saw before me was a Lowry painting come to life. There was ice on the ground, it was all white, freezing cold, and throngs of men and women coming from both directions, all filtering in. And I ended up in the middle of it with my father, who was about to bring me across the factory to the training school. But I remember distinctly hearing the clinking of milk bottles, and a big truck passed in, and it had a lot of milk, a lot of crates. I would say a couple of 100 crates. And it didn't mean anything to me that morning. But you'd later discover that whole truck was bringing, that left empty. That's the amount of milk was going in there, bearing in mind there was 3,500 workers. And I remember being taken over through the factory, and because it was a high ceiling, but it was dark. That was 8 o'clock on December morning. It was still only, the light was only come, and I remember thinking, where am I like? It was like a cave. And we went over through several of the K1, K2, K3, and I ended up in K4. We were introduced to a man called George Lai, who at the time was the supervisor in the training school. And basically then the rest of the day was we were taken around, we were introduced to different managers and brought on a small tour up around the blowing. To me my mind was blown, To most of us, we were only a bunch of young lads, Just, as I said, probably we were I remember being like a mouse being dropped into a jungle. I mean, I had 2 jobs, but I hadn't been introduced to the world at all. These were all adults, and guys in their 20s and, living the life, holidays, cars. This was all ahead of me, so I was, as the saying goes, for a moment I was a bit bamboozled. So, but still very excited that I had started work for real, the real job. And so yeah, it was.
Did you know you were going to be a cutter at that stage?
Oh yes, yeah. As I said, I think there was about 12 of us, and we were the last 12 cutters ever to be taken on. And we were in a section called the Rhine Tour, more commonly known as the flat cutting, which meant we cut stems, flat stem work, flutes on bowls. In other words, the other section was the wedge cutting or the edge cutting. And yeah, we were told, my father had told me that you're going to be a cutter. And I think at that time there might have been the last tranche of blowers taken on. I think there was. And as I said, we were just lucky to get in. There was no more apprenticeships ever after.
And then, obviously you then started your apprenticeship. What was that like? Was it a kind of a very macho kind of thing? Or was it...
Well, there is one funny thing that struck me at the time. As I said, these were all adults, all older guys. And probably some of them were only 21, 22, but to me they were men. And we used to go out onto the benches after the first couple of months of cutting blanks and rejects, they'd be held over for the apprentices to train on, goblets, clarets, the like. And once you got good at that, your training, you went out onto the benches. And I remember, a couple of guys saying things to me one day, and one or two of them even made a kind of a physical move. Now, I was probably after saying something stupid. Young fella didn't know what I was, giving a smart answer or something, thought I was being funny. But I remember thinking, does the bullying, does it follow on? Maybe this is it, is this forever? So I was a little worried about that. In saying that, the excitement of it all completely took over, because you were going out on different benches, you were meeting different guys, you were hearing all the stories. And I have to say straight away, I don't know why, but I was enamoured with the place. I kind of wanted to know everything, even the history of it. And history to me was the most hateful subject, I think, that I ever done. Suddenly I wanted to soak up, and I was drawn to the older men, the senior men. Because once they started, they wouldn't stop. They'd keep telling the stories. And I don't know why. I never figured it out why. I just soaked it up. I had to know more. The first 5 years, you were on, obviously, apprenticeship rates. You got a slagging from the lads over that. We were still on good money for young lads. But you were looking ahead all the time to cutting that 3rd, 4th and 5th year piece. And I loved it, as I said. Sometimes it didn't feel like an apprenticeship to me without being, and I want to stress, without being big-headed about it. I took to the job, and I'm artistic by nature. That has to be the reason. So I became pretty good at the stem work, and I became fast enough that I was accepted by the others, that I wasn't a noose around, whichever bench you were on. Even though there was an allowance being made to the bench to compensate for us, the bench master still expected you to pull up the socks. So I was lucky that way. I was well able to do it. One or two of the lads, and I remember one chap left after about 6 months, just couldn't hack it. Probably everything, just didn't like it, and left and joined the army. And to this day, for all I know, he's probably still there. I don't know. Now, that was unheard heard of. I mean, that would have spread around the factory when the apprentices packed in the job. You just didn't, you know. You didn't give up a job in the glass. In my time in there, I'd say I remember 4 voluntarily giving it up, and one of them happened to be a flat cutter who he left, I'd say, in his mid-30s to become a teacher. So each to their own, you know. But I loved it. I didn't mind, and as I said, I was looking forward to the day when I qualified. Even though I have to say that the 5-year qualifying piece was a hard piece to cut, because you had to satisfy a panel, and it had to be, you know, top notch, and it was a hard piece to cut in my estimation. But I got there, and
you mentioned some of the older men who would be good at telling the stories and so on. What kind of fellas would stand out in your head from the day?
Well, I'll tell you a funny one, and it taught me a lesson, I think, that day when he said it to me. There was a man in there, everybody will remember Frank Leahy, who was a gentleman, loved by everybody, and a most inoffensive man. And he was heavily involved in athletics down through the years, a big name in athletics. And he was the most calm man I ever met, who I used to watch him and I used to think, he just gets on with it. Now, from day one, the only thing I had to have was a radio and headphones, because it got you through the day. Other than that, you were sitting at a wheel cutting between 250 and 300 stems, the same glass, boxes of 24 all day, and it could become monotonous. But the radio saved me, it saved a lot of people. So much so that if I ran out, if the batteries wore down on me, I would just have to leave the factory and go and buy batteries. I'm probably one of the only, at the time I started, was one of the only young fellas who diligently tuned in to Gay Byrne. That was probably from listening to my mother down through the years, you know, being addicted to it, as the country was. I used to turn him on in the mornings, and then I discovered music. And where I discovered music was the Glass Factory. Remember, it was the 80s, and the 80s was only beginning to kick off, the 80s music, which in my estimation was fantastic. But I went down to Frank one day and I said, Frank, I have to ask you something. And at the time they were cutting cutlery handles. Now these were pressed because they were way too narrow for a cutter to cut them. But there was a middle on them, and the middle had to be sharpened up before it went to the acid. And there was thousands, I mean maybe millions of them at the end of it all. And there was a box with about 80 of them in it. And they were slow, monotonous. And Frank would whistle all day. It was just his demeanour. I said to him one day, Frank, how do you get through the day doing the same thing day in, day out, week in, week out? And he said to me, well, he said, I think about things. And maybe he was ahead of his time, maybe he was the original meditation guru. And I said to him, like what? Well, he said, I have a question for you. How would you get from here to Ardkeen without going over a bridge? And I looked at him, and of course I was racking my brains. I said, you'll have to leave that one with me. Sure, I drove myself to insanity for a week, and I had to have the answer. And I went everywhere. There was a bridge, there was St. John's River, that was a bridge. There was everything. I couldn't get there. And I went over on the Friday or whenever it was going off. Frank said, come here, I can't go the weekend. What's the answer? Oh, I don't know. He said, I'm still trying to figure it out. And I thought to myself, that is a lesson, that if the batteries run out on you, relax, calm down, think about something, even hum a tune to yourself, get through it, you know. There was Sean Tracy, Tom O'Connor, Tom passed away there, I'd say about 2 years ago at this stage. They were all very senior men. They were coming up, approaching retirement. And those guys I found fascinating when they told me the old stories of the old factory in Johnstown. You know, when times were, you know, they were hard. We had wheels, they were called a blue wheel and a green. The green literally ripped chunks out of the glass. And then you went back over on the blue to have it smooth enough for the guy on the stone. At one point that blue didn't exist. And they used to have to cut on the rough. And I never got my head around it. I couldn't understand how it was done. Because I tried it a couple of times and I went, this is just hardship. You know, but they told me tales of going home with welts from holding, doing what's called first hand. It was working the wheel that way. And they'd have pieces of lint wrapped around our hands. And even when I was in, as I said, the conditions were a hell of a lot better in the 80s. We used to wrap our thumb in lint because your thumb would get sore. Can you imagine what those guys, and they knew no better, you know. They had gone in and found what they found, you know. So
was there any people there from, we say, Europe last stage?
Well, of course, you know, there was David Cretzen's father. I can't think of his first name. Joe Cretzen. He would have been, you see, the name alone would have been exotic to us. Who's this Joe Cretzen? And after a couple of months, I was beginning to make friends in the blowing and everywhere. And so I'd end up in the blowing. And one day I said to one of the guys, who's that guy over there? And he was, to me, he was a kind of a tough looking man, you know, hardened into work. And but the way he was moving even, it was swift and he said, that's Joe Cretzen. I said, is that Joe Cretzen? I said, right. And I remember he used to sculpt things. I seem to remember, I think, a horse and carriage with horses. David, I meet David sporadically. He'll clarify that for me when I see him. But a thing would come down and somebody said, who made that? Joe Cretzen. So he was dabbling, you know, he was using his skills to show what could be done way ahead of, you know, even when there was a sculpture department. Of course, Mr. Havel, who was the original, you know, he came over here and essentially, you know, started off Waterford Crystal again in Waterford. Now, I remember that man, he used to, before I knew anything about him or the history of the place, this man would appear in a white coat, very distinguished, little tash. And I wondered, and I said one day, who was that? That man, he said, is Mr. Havel. Now, some of the lads would be messing with you and they'd say, go up and call him, you know, whatever, Paddy or... But I was beginning to wise up to this. But there was a man in there one day, I remember him telling me, Noel Kelman, he said, now Paul, he said, when that man comes down, he said, if he comes down, he's so courteous, he asks me, can I use that wheel? You know, it's just his way. And if he ever asked you, he said, can you use the wheel? He'd say, certainly, Mr. Havel. Okay, I said. But he'd come in and I would be fascinated, glued to what he was doing, and the next minute he'd be messing away and he'd hold it up and he'd have an animal or a building or a gun, something sculpted on the wheel in its rough state. He'd go over then and finish it. But really, you know, himself and Tom Cretzen, they to us were a bit kind of exotic. You know, we didn't know many foreign people to speak of. And now there was probably a lot more in there that I knew of at the time, but certainly they're the only two come to mind with me.
And just, you're talking about the craft and the skill and all that kind of stuff. Do you think that would be appreciated enough, the actual craft? Like, you know,
was it or is it?
Well, did we in Waterford or in Ireland?
That's a very good question. Probably not, but it's like everything. When it's made out the road and your brother is making it and comes in and says, I'm sick of making those bloody goblets out there all day, I can't wait for Friday. It kind of takes the pizzazz out of it. But in saying that, who didn't want their glass cabinet full of all, even if they were odd stem glasses, just full of crystal? As I said, it's a good question. We probably didn't appreciate it enough. I think maybe we just took it for granted a little bit. Hence the fact, until you really thought about it, you would say, what's the fascination with this in America? What's the fascination with this in wherever? Until you sat down and analysed it all. That it's an object made the other side of the world by hand and expensive and probably to some people unattainable. But certainly, I suppose the other point to make is that, you know, you'd get breakages and we were used to it snapping. You throw it all in the bin. When you do something that enough, it begins to mean nothing as such to you, other than the fact that it was money gone into the bin. You know, you didn't get paid for that stem that broke. But I probably if you force the issue, I'd say, no, I wouldn't say it was that greatly appreciated.
And did you find the pressure hard? The actual pressure of kind of, you know, the piecework?
No, because as I said, to go back to it, and I'm not boasting in any way, shape or form, I was able to cut fast, but I was a good cutter. Some guys they found it hard. They'd have to work a little bit more at keeping so therefore they were slower. But the trick was to be able to work to piece rate and not to have that glass coming back the next week after all being dipped and marked with red marker by the quality control, because you were recutting it and you weren't getting paid for it. So the trick was speed and skill. Luckily enough, I had it. An awful lot of people had. A lot of guys out there, and they were better than me. There was several guys that would have left me standing, and even I was going, how is he cutting that amount of stems? You know, just very skilled at it. I didn't find it hard, no. It should be pointed out that I was still young. I was in my early 20s. I didn't care about anything. You don't care. And I mean, I was known to disappear for half an hour on end, sometimes go off up around the blowing room and talking to my friends and this. But in my mind, I was well ahead. Target-wise, I was ahead, but sure, you were driving the Benchmaster Coco, because the whole thing was, well, stay here and keep going, we'll make more money. But no, I didn't find it hard. I actually enjoyed it, and if I liked the particular job, it might be a stem, it might be a decanters happened to be my speciality. I was a wizard on them. And so much so that when decanters came in, I knew I was going to be cutting them after the master, because I was so fast at them. I don't know, I just had a knack. And when you get a day like that and you have the radio on and the sounds are coming in, and you know, as I used to say, when the wheel is working right for you, staying smooth, you're not getting lines in the wheel, and if you have a good master cutter cutting it right, because if he was moving his hand or he wasn't consistent, you'd be, you know, moving the glass around. Every piece had to be the same shape to sit on the wheel right. If you got that, you were off. And I did work with some great master cutters, you know.
Who would stand out in your head?
Well, you see, I worked for 5 years with a man named Enda Breen, and a friend of mine, Donald Barry, was also on that bench. Enda was a nice guy. We drove the poor man demented with messing, you know what I mean? And like, there was blackguarding and messing that went on out there. It was untold, but it was all done in good jest, and it got you through the day. But there wasn't a day, I don't think, that I went in there and didn't laugh all day. You know, something would happen, or a joke would be told, and it could lift your whole day. Other master cutters in there. I mean, as I said, Frank Leahy, Tom O'Connor, all of those, they were all the senior cutters. They were all highly skilled at what they done. And it's where you were in trouble, and there was, without mentioning any names, there was one or two who were, as the saying goes, brutal. And by merit, they ended up with a bench and should never have. And the problem with that is they were bad cutters and they were slower. And that seeped down then. You were carrying him, or a good master, and one good guy was carrying another guy. Eventually, later on, it was into the late 80s, the wedge cutters went on an individual piece rate system. Now, in my estimation, the benches, they were all originally 13-man benches, one bench master and his assistant, and 11 with them. They all went down to 5-man benches, and then we never went down to 1-man. The wedge did. It meant you were master of your own outcome. And to me, the bench system was flawed from day one, because if you had a few that were weak, you were carrying them. And I certainly would have liked an individual. It would have suited me, put it that way. It wouldn't have suited the unfortunate guys who were slower. You know?
And then the money was very good.
Well, the money was very good. But again, the irony there is that when you're young and reckless, you don't have a bob left. I mean, I don't think there was a Sunday night that I didn't say to my mother, have you two quid? Which would get you your blaz and your tato and a packet of luncheon, which was bordering on luxury now. 5 or 6 slices in a pack. It was clover luncheon. It's only made locally over the bridge. That was a good day now. But yeah, I'd need 2 or 3 quid off her, and I'd be after blowing every penny. Bear in mind, and this is worth pointing out, that I'm teetotal all my life and I never smoked. So putting it bluntly, where the hell did it go? I always had nice cars. I was a demon for clothes. Always liked the clobber. And the fact that I didn't drink or smoke didn't mean I wasn't out 4 nights a week at the weekend. I was. And as I said, you could go back and say it was a lost opportunity, or you could have been a millionaire. But would you have been? Those guys saved every penny and died young. So I have no regrets. I mean, I spent it when I had it, to paraphrase one of our government officials there. Do you remember a few years ago, I said, when I have it, I'll spend it. I had no mass on money. Didn't know what to do with the thing. A funny story is, there's another man, a good friend of mine, Buddy Cudahy. Buddy is still hale and hearty. On the union, he was a great union man down through the years. And Buddy came in about a year into it and tapped me on the shoulder, never met him. And he said, I want you out in the union office. So we thought we were in trouble. We were after doing something. And when we went out, he must have had 12 or 15 of the apprentices out there. And he said, bring those home. And he handed out leaflets. So I was looking at all this gobbledygook. And someone said, what is it, Buddy? He said, they are... Get your parents to sign those and bring them back to me. They're passed and signed off mortgages. Bank never even met us. The minute he went in and said, we've 18 apprentices. What do you want? And it was for the new phase, the new building of Hillview. And so we were looking, and somebody said, and how much are they? He said they're £12,000, which was now saying they're 400,000. So jaws hit the ground, and somebody had the enough left in him to say, and what way will that be paid? Well, he said, the way it'll be, he said, you'll be paying £14 a week for 25 years. To a bunch of lunatics in front of you. It's a wonder he wasn't... kicked out the door. We went home to this thing, and I remember I threw it over on the table, and the father, well, here, he said, I'll sign it. He must have been going, my God, what an opportunity. All we saw was 14 quid a week out of our wages for 25 years. We weren't thinking 25 days ahead. He was ridiculed and laughed at. They went in the bin. It never happened. And, you know, as I said, might have been a golden opportunity. But it's one of those things. Funnily enough, I would say the following year we went to Tormelinas. I remember 13 of us went. And as far as I know, at the time, Tormelinas was about £900 or more for the 2 weeks. And we probably had 500 or 600 in our pocket to spend. When you think about that, that was 3 or 4 years mortgage. Again, no regrets.
And just on the money side of it, like, there would have been a bit of resentment in other factories in Waterford about the rate of pay that you were getting.
Well, this was always a bone of contention, and I got into more heated debates about it. Even, I would say, even up to, I could still get into a heated debate about it. We were overpaid, right? It was scandalous what we were earning, this, that and the other. You must bear in mind that, okay, the craft workers were well paid. There were some other jobs in the glass factory that were only marginally higher than the guy doing the same thing in another factory. So it wasn't a big metropolis of millionaires. And the bone of contention I have is this. What I was paid, I worked for. It was piece rate system. And that's not to say the piece rate system was, it was still tight. You still had to work. It wasn't as if you were getting a £5 per glass. It was pennies you were earning. So anything that I earned, I worked hard for. So I never went along with that. I never went along with it. But yeah, and we used to get a bit of slagging, and often a row would break out somewhere, you know. A smart aleck comment, you know. So what would you know about hardship, or what would you know about this, that or the other? Which wasn't true at all, because as I said to you, sure, I hadn't a bob in my pocket going around. It was doing me no good, you know. In saying that, it also has to be said, every penny we earned, every penny, bar a foreign holiday, was left in this town. You know, Thursdays was payday, Fridays was a big day in Waterford, and Saturday. And I'm not saying, well, we ran Waterford. We didn't. There was lots and lots of industries, but the glass factory had a sizable part of all that. Remember, I always say it was a town in a city, or a very large village in a big town. I mean, Waterford, you know, it was big enough, but it was actually a town out there. 3,500 people getting paid weekly. It wasn't even as if it was monthly. Every week that money was spent, and most of it, you know.
And like I was going to say something now. It just got down my head. So when you became a master cutter yourself then, what was that like?
Well, there's another funny story there as well, because when I eventually qualified, and so then you were straight up onto the qualified rate. So you got a sizable raise in your flat week, and you were on the full piece, well, not the full, but you were on a much higher percentage of the piece rate. So you got a raise. But another 3 years went by, and I remember I used to slag the senior men. And I used to say to them, because I remember reading, there's a book that they brought out in the 70s. Now I have it at home, and apparently They're getting rare. I still have the sleeve on it. It's a little battered. It was one of the first authentic books, beautifully produced. And I remember reading, and I was only 6 or 7 years there, and my eyes popped out, and I said, and at 8 years they become a master cutter. Of course, I was in the next morning. Tom, I've only a year and 2 months. Well, I may as well have said to them now that they were technically unqualified. They went mental. Said, it's not, it's 25, 30. We're a master cutter. But I said, Tom, it's in the book. I didn't realise this. I said, I'll be a... And you were a master cutter at 8 years. But to be quite honest with you, I don't think even on the day I would have known. It wasn't something that was in your psyche and you were waiting patiently for. Well, maybe I was. I was probably waiting for that morning at 8 o'clock to go into the lads and inform them that I was now a master cutter. For some people, for all it meant, you know, as I said to you, there was real master cutters, and then the less said, the better, probably.
And then the Glance had a big reputation for being, we say, willing to stand up as in relation to things like other issues in Ireland at the time, whether it be the tax march,
or
Northern Ireland, or even we say looking to England to the miners and stuff like that. So, I mean, do you remember all that? I
remember it all clearly, yeah. Again, I go back to the fact that I was young and reckless. I didn't care about anything, only wine, women and song, bar the wine. But still, something in me, and to this day I would be very interested in that side. I was clued into all of that, you know. It probably helped that friend of mine, Donald Barry, he's actually running now for as an independent in the local election soon. He was very into all that, so I'd be listening to him, and I learned a lot listening to him. And I remember the strikes and the solidarity. The new book down in the book centre at the moment on Waterford Crystal has a photograph of Scargill with Jimmy Kelly. I'm not sure who else was in the photo. He came over, left him blow a piece of glass. He came over at that time. We would have been vehemently against Thatcher. I mean, well, we weren't the only ones. Half the world thought she was a demon. The tax strikes, I remember, somebody saw it in me that I was artistic. So I was deemed the guy to do the posters. And of course I agreed, yeah, I'll do the posters. And I said, where will I do them? We'll do them on the train on the way up. There must have been 200 of us on the train. And they handed me this card. There must have been 100 sheets of card, big yolks, and a big bag of black and red and blue markers. Sure, it took the whole 100-mile journey writing, about the tax cuts and fairness to the workers. But at the time now, we were being fleeced. I mean, you got your brown pay pack and you went, wow, that's tasty. And you just, the wind was taken out of your sails. No matter, you knew what was going to happen, but you still opened it. And you went, my God. And then you looked at the tax. And that's what fired us up out there, because we were earning good money. And I suppose there was a feeling that we were being more hard done by than others. A bit like now with the wealthy and should they pay more tax than other people. So that's what fired us up. I remember sitting beside, he's now long gone from us, Shammy Power. A good lot of people will remember him as quite the character. And Shammy was there telling me what to write on it with the real lingo. And half it, I didn't know what I was writing, but I was doing it all. So that was quite a trip. And I remember up there distinctly up outside Leinster House, and I remember the trip back down. Like, there was tea and coffee was laid on for us. We all had our own stuff with us as well. But yeah, all those things. And the other thing has to be pointed out again, not blowing a trumpet on behalf of that, but there was some mighty work done for charities. We were a pretty good bunch when it came to dipping the hand into the pocket. And whenever anything happened, a catastrophe or a disaster in the town, invariably someone would be down to you did after. We're putting together we're collecting, or we're putting together a signature or whatever. Someone would say, right, let's help these people. I guess it all comes under camaraderie,
And given your artistic interest and all that kind of stuff, did you ever get tempted over to, we say, the engraving?
Well, I did. I had a huge, one of the world's most well-known engravers, Tom Hayes, was a friend of mine because he had a little bodybuilding club, and I was in the club. But I used to go out to him. I'd say I used to go out to him 2 or 3 times a week. He was in a tiny little hub where he cut some of the most beautiful artistic pieces for every corner of the world. They ended up. And I loved listening to him, and I loved watching the art. Now, I knew, and I know now, I wouldn't have been able for engraving. I'm not that type of artistic. But the sculpture really grabbed me. And I remember, I was only in there a couple of weeks, and I saw a guy making a thing on the wheel, and I said to him, "What's that? Look," he said. And he had a tiny little heart. I was looking at this thing, and then he proceeded to put scallops around the heart. And then it had to go to the dip, and it needed a hole. So it came back with a hole in it. One of the lads in the engraving or somewhere would have drilled it for him. And it came back, and this was a beautiful little piece. And I said to him, "What are you going to do now?" He said, "I'm going to go down and buy a silver chain. And that's for the girlfriend tonight," he said. And he said, "I'll be a hero." Sure, off I went. I'd say if I made one heart, I made 500. Everybody, the lads, "I need 2 hearts." "What do you need 2 for? You've only one." "I need 2. You didn't ask." I made hundreds of these things, and you dipped them, and I gave them I gave them. I'd say I gave them to everyone. Again, I was able to do more slightly artistic ones. I used to push the boat out a little. But the other thing is that every bin you passed had broken glass. Obviously, breakages, hundreds of them. And it could be a long stem, might be the bowl of a goblet, and you'd see something in it. And I would salvage these pieces. Of course, I also had, at this stage, I had loads of friends in the blowing room. And the Swans, quite possibly the most iconic hot merchandise, put it that way, because the glass, until very, very later on, never produced them. They were artisan pieces, the likes of the Cretsons, all these men doing them. But they were highly sought after. Probably not, at the time, there probably wasn't a house complete if you hadn't 2 Waterford glass swans in the window. And now they were blown. So then I'd get the boys to make me a shape that I might need to shape stuff up. I applied a few times to the sculpture department. And I remember making a tin whistle when there wasn't one. Another big one out there was pyramids. And into the back you would cut a chalice. So when you looked into the flat facet, it was 3D. Skilled little piece of work. I remember putting the Eiffel Tower on it. And then one day I made the Challenger, the spacecraft Challenger. And I still have it to this day, and that was engraved by Tom Hayes. So that's a special piece. I was never successful in getting in there. I'd say I was probably too young and wild, and that's being straight about it. Had I stayed, I left in 1992, maybe 5 years later I might have made inroads. But it didn't bother me because I loved it, and so obsessed was I that I would cram down my lunch at 1 o'clock, be gone by 10 past, and spend the next 20 minutes cutting and then go back cutting. I mean, guys they'd run out the gate just to get out and hear traffic, or some of them would eat their lunch and go the whole circle of the glass factory in the half hour. Me, no. Any chance I got, even in the morning break, because I'd be after starting a piece and I'd be so enamoured with it, I had to see the result. That's passion, obsession, I don't know.
And during you wrote a play called The Glass. So what was your motivation for doing that?
The motivation, and I didn't know it then, but there's an old saying, you'd hear it in Waterford, you could write a book about it. And subconsciously that was probably going into my mind. And as the years were going by, I found I liked to scribble poems and poetry and short stories, and I would often, I won 1 or 2 colouring competitions when I was 8 or 9 years of age, when competitions were on Kellogg's boxes and chocolate wrappers. Now that's all unheard of now. And I probably submitted a few little poems and stories, so I was always writing. And then when I left, something clicked. It was like a hindsight thing. And I have to say I wanted to leave, I wanted to move on, but I very much missed it. I still miss it to this day. Both the job and the camaraderie and just the whole damn madness of it all, because it was fantastic, in my view. And looking, so I said one day, I better start doing this and it was right at that time I entered the world of theatre by pure chance as I left the glass. It's just one of those things. And I dabbled in, first thing I ever done was props for the Tops of the Town. And I remember going up to the rehearsal room and thinking, wow, what is this? Richie Hayes, Brian Flynn was directing.
Was this a glass show?
This was the glass show, yeah.
Okay.
And of course, it being the glass, they had a huge big warehouse at their disposal, anything they wanted at their disposal. And I remember entering the craziest thing I'd ever seen, which was the rehearsals for the Tops. And something clicked with me then, done a few more props, bit of backstage, and then one day Brian Flynn asked me to step on stage. And without hesitation, which kind of tells you, there was no, Jesus, I'm not going over beyond that red curtain. And then I was getting interested in scripts and directors, watching the directors, so I said, I better start doing it. And that was that, desire to do something personal in theatre, and knowing that I had an absolutely watertight story. You couldn't, I done a play, I think there's scope for 5 more different types of plays on it, because I wanted to show the camaraderie, the fun, the blackguardism, and the sadness of the strike, and the desecration it causes between friends, family. So, but you could take any of those genres on their own and write a separate play. So that was, and I dawdled with it for a long, long time. I never actually settled. And I had, I always remember Brian Collins, I had his head blown by, and he said to me one day, you're no more writing that play now than I am. Because in my mind it was done, it was a Clark's box, shoebox of notes, crammed. And I met a friend of mine then, and luckily she decided, well, I have the patience to sit down with you and type this up for you. And that's when it happened. And all of those notes had to be, and probably something hit him and said, I'll fix you, Collins. But when Brian saw it, then he said, man, he said, this has to go on. And the rest is history. It was a great success. If I wanted to achieve 2 things, and I achieved them, I wanted to make people laugh or cry. And the director almost, when you've written something and you've directed it, you have either the torture or the comfort of being able to sit up in the back row and watch. And I remember looking at one woman, and she cried and laughed. And I saw a couple of men crying. And I knew, I said, I've nailed this, because it was a company of laughter and tears.
And was that after the factory closed?
No, that was after the strike. The factory, it struggled on then for another... No, sorry, I beg your pardon. It was closed. It was closed about a year or two. And I remember the day, you know, some people won't understand what I'm about to say. A lot of guys will say, that man is mad, you know. But I remember I was driving and an announcement came out on the radio that the glass was gone. The gates were locked. And I had to stop and pull in, because it just caught me emotionally. And it was like a piece of me was after being closed or stopped. And I remember meeting lots of people after me said, I was eating and I had to stop. Guys it was a very, very sad day, you know, and a disgraceful day that a company should have been allowed, even by our government, one of the most iconic brands in the whole world. And from an Irish point of view, probably more famous than Guinness, probably more iconic in my estimation, and just allowed to go. But I remember, I was really taken. So then I thought, this is it, something has to happen. I have to get this play out, because, you know, in the superlatives of the end told us that it struggled on for another number of years, but it was never the same. You know, and the guys that were left in there, I used to ask them, and does such a thing go on? Jesus, no. And do you still do such a thing? Oh, no. You know, little things like the pound draw. And the pound draw was every Thursday, you put £1 in an envelope, Paul Barry, 4853, and you went out to the canteen, and that in itself was a little journey. It was great. You were going out to you went out and you dropped it into a drum. And that evening, Thursday evening, the drum was spun, and they were all pulled out. And there was a 400, say 5 or 6 100s, a dozen £50, a couple of 25s, and maybe the last £9 that was left. And the names went up on a board, but sure, even then the messing started, because you'd go out and fill in somebody's name, Ollie Bresnan, and a spurious number, put it in with no pound. Ollie'd be strung up the next morning, Friday morning, some fella get the 50 of them, he'd be delighted. He'd open them all up at home, he'd only have 49. And he'd come in the next, come here you. And you'd be looking at him, what? And I even saw one poor devil one day, he said, I didn't put it in. Well, he said, your name was in it and there was no pound. No, Potter, I'll give you the pound, he said, and gave it to him. I was thinking, this is getting out of control. But you had the real messers who could go out and put 5 of them in, or 10 of them, but nothing in it. And that didn't happen a lot. But again, then you had Friday morning coming in, wonder who won the few, did I get a few bob? You came down, your name was up on it, your whole weekend was changed, you know what I mean? As I said, all of those things stopped. All that fun was gone in the latter years. I suppose maybe there was no real incentive to have fun in there, because in my estimation probably the last 5 years were tenuous. You were probably going in every day wondering what was going to happen, you know. But halcyon days, in my estimation, it was the best place ever in the world to work, and definitely there will never be anything like it again, definitely. Not because of health and safety and because of this, that and the other. Everything now is just, it'll never be, the likes of it will never be seen again. You know, I loved it. I knew guys who dragged themselves in every morning, hating every minute of it, detested the place. To me, they were enigmas. I could not get to the bottom of it because I loved it. But as I say, I was a bit of a messer, so it got me through the day. And
well, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, there was a young Paul Barry now, 15 or 16 or 17, whatever, there isn't any opportunities like that anymore, is there?
No, as I said, it'll never be seen again. Now you're going into a company, it's rules, regulations, health and safety, hygiene. You have to have this exam, you have to have that. Okay, with the exceptions of apprenticeships, which I'm told are on the way back. They have to come back because we have a dearth of builders, plasterers, whatever. With the exception of that, I mean, going into your factories these days that they manufacture, but in a completely different way. I don't think young people going into jobs these days will ever experience, I'm not saying it would be boring, it would be far more regimental, I'd say. In saying that, sometimes it was beyond control, the messing. You know what I mean? The fun and the camaraderie. You kind of go some days, how does this even happen? But it was the way of the times, it was the way of the times. And it got us through the day, as I said. I mean, some jobs now won't even allow a radio. A friend of mine has gone into a job and he said there's no radio, no phone, you can't have a book. And it's a 12-hour shift of what he describes as monotonous work. Now, can you imagine that? As I said, I came up with Gay Byrne, the great Eddie Cody, WLR when it was a pirate radio station, Roddy Clear. Roddy was a cutter. I worked with Roddy for 5 years beside him, and he would go down and do pirate radio in the nights. When I could, if I was at a loose end, go and get a couple of cans of Coke and walk up the stairs to him, walk in, give him a can, stick on such a thing, will you? No bother. And he would literally pull it and put it on. Even that's gone. As I said, halcyon days, I loved them, so.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.
That's great. And will you do another play?
Yeah.
About the glass sometime?
About the glass, no, and we put it on twice. Well, it went on twice that year, and 5 years later, which is about 4 years ago, we put it on again and we brought it to Dungarvan. Now, I feel I'm done with it. Maybe if somebody would like to do it, fine by me. And even at that, you'd be thinking, it's with trepidation, who would be taking it? Will it ever be like the way it was? And it wouldn't be, because a director would have his own touches. Would I write I wouldn't write a play on it. What I would love to do is turn it into either a film script or for a mini-series. Maybe the likes of RT or somebody would make a 6-parter or a 4-parter. And in my estimation, it would be predominantly a comedy. It would have to be, because as I said, you laughed all day in there. So I think that's what I'm going to try and do with it. Again, I don't know where to start. They say a script is you only change a certain amount of it. There's not a big, I don't know, I'm about to learn. I'm working on 1 or 2 other plays, nothing to do with the glass, but no, I think the glass is done. Again, without sounding, and I really don't mean to sound like I'm boasting. The play, it came off so well for us all and for the cast that, no, I'm going to leave it. It's done. It's like your Fawlty Tower scenario. They only done a certain amount, and that was it. They left it as it was.
That's true. What was it? One series?
Oh no, it was one series. I think it was about 12.
Just before you finish, Paul, just show us this, because I think it's kind of cute.
Yeah. Again, as I said, I was always mad to do. I was always sculpting something, predominantly hearts, to break hearts. But this, I picked this out of that was the handle of a big old Waterford jug. And the minute I saw it, I just had a brainwave, and I put it that way. Now, there was a lot of shaping still to do, I just saw from that the Loch Ness Monster. I just saw the hump of his back. So that's what's called diamond cut on the top. That's flat cutting, what I used to do. So I put it there. So then we needed a tail for him. So I got another little piece, just any shape of glass, and I shaped it that way. And then this was the one that had to be shaped. It took a lot of polishing on a polishing wheel to come up with the, there's the head of him. And I never actually submitted it. Maybe I should have. I think it's a nice little thing, a quirky, you know, and very simply made. But at least I can say that it's the only one in the world and unique to me. Make me a good offer now and it's yours.
Thanks very much, Paul. Cheers.